Welcome to the training on how to successfully start and grow a raised bed garden. This training is for gardeners who want to start and grow a raised bed garden so that they can actually harvest delicious fresh produce from home. So, whether you've never grown a garden or have had a garden going for a few years, this training is going to help you get started or level up your gardening game. After this training, you'll know exactly what to do to start and grow your garden, and so that you can grow vegetables all season long. But first, if we haven't met yet, my name is Audrey, and I have an online blog and YouTube channel called Audrey's Little Farm. I have grown a garden my entire life. I've had chickens my entire life, and I have such a passion for these things that I was inspired to start my online business to reach as many people as I could to help them get started, whether they have acres of space or even just a backyard or possibly even just a patio garden. I feel that everybody should have the privilege of growing their own food at home. And so that is my passion, and you can find all of my information at Audrey's Little Farm. So to begin, let's go over what is raised bed gardening. It's a wonderful gardening method where the garden beds are built up off the ground, and you can either build your own or buy already pre-assembled gardening beds. Both are really good options. And it's a really wonderful option for all gardeners, but it's really beneficial if you're just getting started because once you get them filled up with good quality soil, you will be ready for planting. Whereas if you're planting directly in the ground, which is also a method that I love, it just requires a little bit more prep work. The soil might be really hard, which might require you to get a tiller to loosen up that soil so the roots can grow down. There's just lot more things that go into it. And if you don't have good soil, then you may need to amend that soil to begin with. But if you just start off with your raised beds filled with a good quality mix, you're going to be off to a really good start. And so now let's go over some of the other benefits of raised bed gardening. So, the very first benefit is that raised bed gardening is so much easier on the body for planting and harvesting. But here's one thing to keep in mind, and this actually just came to me as I was getting ready for this presentation today, and that is that you see a lot of raised bed gardens that are really, really tall off the ground, making it make you feel that you have to have this really tall raised bed so that it's easier to harvest and plant, which is the case, but being tall does not necessarily mean better. If your raised bed is too tall, it can actually make harvesting harder because the plants that grow tall, such as a tomato, that can end up being 5 to 6 feet tall, are going to be way up over your head. And so, just keep in mind that raised bed gardening is easier because your plants are confined, but they don't have to be really tall raised beds, which we're going to get into the sizes that you should have for your raised beds and all of those important aspects. But as I say, how it's easier on your body, which is true, sometimes that makes people think that they need to have a really tall raised bed, and that's not necessarily the case. It's just nice having your plants in one little area and keeping things confined. So that is the first benefit. And the second benefit is that it keeps your plants confined to a certain area. So if you have plants growing wild, they just get into the walkways and they intertangle with each other. And then sometimes you end up walking all over your plants, which is not ideal. And so keeping them confined to one specific area really makes gardening nice. And so in these two pictures, for example, everything looks nice and neat. And you have a very distinct walkway, which is really nice because then you can put down gravel or bark to suppress the weeds and just keep things a little bit more neat and organized. Whereas if you have one huge plot of land, you're going to be walking through the centers. You can't really have distinct walkways. And so having your raised bed set up to keep things organized is a really great part of raised bed gardening. The third benefit is that the soil tends to be easier to work with in a raised bed because you're not constantly walking in it. Actually, you probably should never be walking in it. If you make your raised bed the correct size, you shouldn't have to get inside. So the soil tends to stay pretty nice and fluffy, whereas soil directly in the ground is going to be hard and compacted. And so being that it's easier to work with makes everything a lot easier. The planting is easier, pulling out weeds is easier. If you're harvesting root crops, that's going to be easier. And so the soil in your raised beds is a really nice benefit compared to in-ground planting. The fourth benefit is that it's easier to implement companion planting strategies and practice crop rotation. Companion planting means planting specific plants together that complement one another. Sometimes this is done to help complement the growth of two or more plants in a garden bed, And other times, companion planting just means planting certain crops near one another to prevent pests or attract beneficial insects. One of my favorite flowers to plant for this is marigolds. Marigolds are really great at deterring pests, but then they also bring some color into your garden and it brings some pollinators around. Marigolds specifically aren't a great pollinator flower. However, they keep the pests away and they just bring some color into your garden. But if you want to attract pollinators, lavender is a really great one. Just some ornamental flowers, you can plant them in pots around your raised beds. And any way that you can get some pollinators into your garden is really beneficial. You can also, at times, let some of your herbs or vegetables bolt and go to flower, and that will also attract the pollinators. So there's so many ways that you can attract them to your garden, and so that's always a benefit. And along with the companion planting, crop rotation is another really beneficial gardening strategy, and raised beds make it really simple. So, for example, it's beneficial in most circumstances to keep crop families together because they typically require the same care and needs, and they attract the same pests. And it's not that you want pests, but you don't want the same pest in the same bed year after year. So if you rotate the crops, then that like collection of bugs that are living in that bed will kind of make its way out when that different crop is there, and they'll go on to the next bed, and it just doesn't give too much of a population that continuous growth year after year. And so, for example, in year 1, you can plant your cole crops in bed A, your cucurbits in bed B, and nightshades in bed C. Then year 2, your cole crop in bed B, cucurbits in bed C, and nightshades in bed A. And you can just easily keep track of this in a little notebook, but having the distinct raised bed makes it really easy to remember where things were as long as you're keeping track, and keep this rotation cycling year after year. And so I definitely believe that the benefits far outweigh the cons of raised bed gardening. However, there are a few cons to keep in mind. Just a few. One of the downsides is your upfront cost of buying the materials to build your own beds or buying pre-assembled beds. But if you buy a good quality brand or build them with good quality materials, you should have garden beds that last for quite a while. The next upfront cost is filling your garden beds with a good quality mixture of soil, which we'll get into. Although, just like the initial cost of anything, in time, it's going to pay for itself. And the process of having a garden and having that fresh produce right outside your back door is such a wonderful thing. And so don't worry too much about the upfront cost, but they need to be mentioned because there is a bit to it. However, there's some things that you can do that will take away from these costs. And so we'll get into that as we go over the different materials you can use for raised beds and how you can fill them up. And now the next con of raised beds is that your space is limited. So you can't plant, for example, I have some really long rows that are actually in the ground where I plant my tomatoes, because tomatoes can tend to get really big. And so I really never even worry about how many tomatoes I'm planting. I just have these really long rows and I just plant the whole thing with tomatoes. But if I were going to be planting tomatoes in raised beds, then my space is limited. I can only plant as many plants as that raised bed can hold. And so certain larger crops like tomatoes and winter squashes can quickly take up the entire amount of space. And so if you have multiple garden beds, this may not be an issue, but if your space is limited, it's important to keep in mind at planting time how large each crop is going to get so that you can plant a variety of things without just one thing taking up all of your garden space. And now, once it comes time to build or buy your raised beds, here are some options. First, you can build your own from wood. The pictures shown here, one is just a really simple setup, just with a single board on all sides, and the other one is built up off the ground a little bit more. Both are pretty great options. You should consider using cedar or redwood because both of those types of wood are going to last much longer. If you use different types of wood such as Douglas fir, black locust, or pine, they are still good quality wood to build your beds with, but they're definitely not going to last as long as cedar or redwood. And so consider using cedar or redwood. But if you want to go the more inexpensive route and use something like pine, it's definitely an option and there's no harm in that. But you're just going to likely have to replace them sooner than you would if you use a different type of wood. Another great material to consider is if you're building your own raised beds is cinder blocks or brick. They're both really sturdy materials that won't rot away. And if you're building your raised beds on top of existing soil or on top of dirt, you don't really have to make your raised bed very high. We're going to get into the height in just a little bit, but you just have to go up 6 to 12 inches. And so that could be just a really simple raised bed to build or set up in your yard. Here are some other options. So the wonderful thing about gardening is that you don't completely need a raised bed built up off the ground. You can simply just separate an area with a rock border, with sticks, with wood, or even garden edging that you can buy at your local garden center. A great way to get started is to just get creative with the materials that you already have. And, if it's not in your budget to go buy raised beds or to buy the wood to build them, just block off a certain area with a little border, which is not necessarily necessary, but it's nice to have a specific garden area. So I feel like it just makes you treat that area a little bit better when it's blocked off. So even if you just did a little rock border and then you amend that soil like you would as if it were a raised bed, you can have a really great garden bed that is very simple. And if you don't plan on building, I think one of the best options is the Ollie Gardens raised bed. This year, I actually tried out a few different raised beds from this company. I have always built our own raised beds and I've planted directly in the ground. And so I never had a raised bed that I was recommending to anybody because I hadn't tried any. Well, this year I now have one full year under my belt with these raised beds and I really, really like them. If you just go to olliegardens.com, I believe it's just olliegardens.com. You can find these raised beds and they're really good quality. They're lightweight, so they're easy to move around. They're made from galvanized steel that's coated with alu zinc, and so it makes them resistant to rot and rusting. And after you assemble them, they say they should last for 20 plus years. I only have 1 year under my belt, but so far they seem really great. And so if you want to get started right away, these would be a really great option that are easy to put together. And then here are just a few of the different raised beds they have. They have long oval beds, they have rectangle beds, they have modular beds that stack on top of each other. They have round beds. There's so many different options. So there's a great selection to choose from if you choose to go this route. And now let's talk about raised bed length and width. As far as the size of your beds, here's what I recommend. As far as the length, that really doesn't matter. But typically most beds are around 8 to 10 feet long. But for the width, I recommend keeping them 3 to 4 feet wide at the most, because once they're any wider than that, you can't reach into the center. And so then you have to then start getting inside of your raised bed to harvest and plant, and that kind of defeats the purpose of having your raised bed. You want to be able to reach into the center to harvest your fruits and veggies. You also want to be able to reach into the middle to pull weeds and to plant. So 3 to 4 feet is ideal. And then now let's talk about height. So here's 3 different pictures. So if you're growing on top of soil, your raised beds only need to be about 6 to 12 inches tall because the roots of the plants can grow into that soil beneath your raised bed. And so really tall beds are just unnecessary because then you're just filling them with a lot more soil than you needed to buy. And that just costs more money. And so having your raised beds lower to the ground makes things more cost effective. And that's all that's necessary. But if you're planting or if you're putting your raised bed on cement or on rock or anything that's not soil, then it's recommended to have your raised beds at least 18 inches tall. And that gives your roots plenty of room to grow and not get root bound. And then one consideration is if you need your raised bed taller because of a disability or because maybe you just really need things more up off the ground because your health doesn't allow you to bend down or get down on your knees to plant, totally understandable. And that's where taller raised beds definitely come in handy, but you can build them up off the ground and make them taller versus making the bed really deep and filling it with a ton of soil. So that picture on the right shows a raised bed built up off the ground, but it's still only about 8 to 12 inches deep. So that's a really good option if you need that raised bed higher. And now, where to put your raised beds. So you need to make sure that wherever your raised beds are is getting 6 to 8 hours of light per day. And that's kind of on the minimum side, but it should give you plenty of light for your vegetables to grow healthy. And it doesn't have to be consecutive. It doesn't have to be 6 to 8 hours in a row, but in the whole course of the day, your plants need at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. And now, what type of soil to use? Trying to figure out what materials to fill your raised beds with can definitely be overwhelming, especially if you're searching the internet. You can literally go down a deep rabbit hole with so many different suggestions and ideas. But here's a very simple method. Think of your raised beds as an expansion of your garden or an expansion of nature, which is a majority of real soil, sand, silt, and clay. Think about the process of when you plant trees or flowers. You don't usually plant them in raised beds filled with store-bought potting mix. You just plant them directly into the ground, and they tend to do pretty well. But for some reason, when it comes to vegetable gardens, people tend to overcomplicate it. And so, for the simple answer of what soil is best, you can simply mix clean topsoil and compost together, and that is a wonderful mixture for your raised beds. It should be about 80% topsoil and 20% compost, and you would just mix that evenly together, and that is a really good mixture for your raised beds. And if you need to, you can go ahead and also mix in a bag of raised bed soil. They make specific bags of just raised bed soil, and it just kind of might add a little bit more to the texture of your soil and make it a little bit more airy if it seems a little bit too dense or like there's too much topsoil. Just a little bit of raised bed soil can help break that up a little bit. But you definitely want the topsoil because that's what holds on to moisture. The clay is what naturally retains moisture in the ground and keeps, if you have, or so for example, if you just have a mixture of potting mix, the soil or the water just drains right out, which means you have to water more frequently. When you water something in the ground, the soil just naturally retains moisture, and so you don't have to water as much, and it's just a much better situation. And the other problem, if you use something like a three-way mix of peat moss and compost and topsoil, is that 2/3 is organic material, which means that over time, that is just going to keep decomposing. And so then every year, you're going to have to add in more soil to your raised beds. And so a mix like that is really nice. It feels fluffy, and your vegetables will grow great in it, but it dries out quicker, so you have to water more often, and it decomposes, which means that you have to just keep adding to it. But when you have a majority topsoil, that doesn't decompose, and so you may have to add a tiny bit every now and then because the little bit of compost that you add in is going to decompose, but you're going to have a majority of your beds filled year after year, and then that tiny bit of amending that you do each season with some compost and mulch is going to keep your beds filled, and you don't have to continue adding to them year after year. And now, trying to figure out how much soil and compost to buy. So, as you prepare to fill up your garden beds, keep in mind that soil in bulk is typically measured in yards, whereas soil in bags is typically measured in cubic feet. So here's the formula you will need to convert the size of your raised beds into cubic yards. Length times width times depth divided by 27. And that is going to equal yards of soil. And here's the formula for cubic feet. Length times width times depth, and that will equal cubic feet of soil. So it's important to know that if you're buying soil in bulk, which typically topsoil is pretty easy to find sold in bulk, and so if you're buying more than a yard of soil, you should just get it delivered in bulk. It makes things really easy, really so much easier. But if you can't get it delivered in bulk, then it's likely that you're going to be having to buy it in cubic feet. Okay. And now, without getting too in depth, I just want to provide a basic overview of soil health and structure. Beneath the soil and around the roots of our plants, we have worms, microbes, bacteria, and all sorts of living organisms. And they benefit our soil and our plants. And so it's really in our best interest to avoid disrupting the soil. The more we can just let it be and just continue to amend it each year, practice crop rotation, and implement things like cover crops, the healthier our soil will be. And that's where the idea of no-till gardening comes in. It's the practice of never tilling our soil so that we can keep everything living in there alive. But I encourage you to research deeper if you need more of an explanation. But minimizing tillage is really a great idea. But eliminating it altogether is really not necessary for healthy soil. Here and there, you may need to till your soil, and that is not going to kill all the life in the soil. In fact, if you never till, you may never really experience a healthy garden. For example, in really cold areas, the soil needs to be broken apart and opened up to warm up for spring planting. If not, it kind of just almost stays dormant down there because the soil stays so cold. And if you don't really break it up, the soil can't warm up well enough to get things ready for spring planting. And if the ground is too hard, then roots are not going to grow well. And so there's a lot of really good studies out there, and it's more on larger scale farms, but they've practiced both no-till and tilling. And when they look up the organic matter in the soil, not much really changes. Actually, the farmers that do till have much more organic matter deeper down in the soil, which makes sense because that top layer is getting a little bit disturbed. But the no-till soil wasn't necessarily healthier. And all the living organisms still lived in both soils. And so it's definitely about a happy medium. Don't be worried about breaking up your soil when it's necessary, but definitely avoid disrupting it when you don't need to. We have to have that fine balance. Okay, and now the next thing that you need to do after you plant your vegetables is to mulch. Mulch is really great for maintaining moisture in the heat, and it breaks down over time and adds nutrients back into your soil. And a really great mulch for vegetables is straw, but you can also use wood chippings and shredded leaves. But be sure to look up the type of leaves or wood that you're using because not all wood chopped up and not all leaves are safe for vegetables. So look up that first, but straw is always safe, and so that's a really great one. Another common thing you'll hear many people suggest is using grass clippings. And these are okay, but you have to be careful with them because when you get too deep of a layer of grass clippings, it tends to get moldy, and that's not a great combination for your garden beds. So you can have a really thin layer of grass clippings, or you can just opt out of using them altogether and stick with straw. It's a really great mulch. And then each year you need to amend your garden beds. So once or twice a year before planting, it's really wise to amend your soil. But the great thing is that it's really simple. You can just spread a couple inches of compost on top of your soil, and that's all that's needed. You don't need to till it in, just spread a thin layer on top. And so when you're first building your beds, then at that point you should mix your soil and compost together. But after your raised beds are filled and now you're just amending, you can just spread a thin layer on top, and all of the life in your soil is going to bring that compost down into the roots of your plants, and it's just going to have its own little process throughout the year that feeds your plants. And so just spreading it right on top is all that you need to do. And another great way to amend your soil is to plant cover crops. Cover crops are typically planted in the fall, and they put nitrogen back into your soil, and then you can even till the plants in after the cover crop is done growing, and that will put the organic matter back into the soil that will feed your plants over time as well. And so now for the fun part, which is planning what to grow. But in the planning process, there are a few important things to consider. First, how much space do you have? Second, some plants can get really big, and so will you have the room to grow them? So let's start off with going more in depth on the first question, which is how much space do you have? If you only have enough space for 1 or 2 raised beds, you will have to be pretty selective on what you can grow. But if you have space for at least 4 raised beds, you won't have to be quite as selective. And depending on how many beds you have, you may not have to be picky at all, which is always really fun. So you'll likely have room to plant everything you want if you are not limited on space, but I completely understand if you are limited on space. So let's go over what to do if you're a little bit limited on space. So here are some tips if your space is limited. The first thing is to grow determinate variety tomatoes versus indeterminate. Indeterminate tomato plants continue to grow and produce fruit throughout the entire growing season, and they can get really big. And determinate tomato plants are smaller, bush-type varieties, and they stop growing around 3 to 4 feet tall. They bloom and produce most of their fruit all at once, And once the plant is done producing, it will start to decline and you can just tear it out, and then you may even have space for something else. So a few determinate varieties include Romas, San Marzano, and Bush Early Girl. However, I know it's nice to have a plant that will continue producing vegetables or tomatoes all season long. And so you can also plant semi-determinate varieties, and a few include Celebrity Plus, Puron Sprayless, and Sugary Hybrid. And now the second tip for maximizing your space is to use a trellis and grow things vertically when possible. So not all vegetables can grow up a trellis, but a few that can include pole beans, peas, and cucumbers. And it's such a great practice because you can grow some veggies upward and then you can plant a row of a different crop at the base of those plants, and it really uses up that space wisely in your raised beds. I have a trellis set up inside my raised bed with T-posts and a hog panel, and that works really great. It's super sturdy. But there are so many other trellis ideas, such as netting or bamboo stakes, whatever you choose to use. Just being able to grow things vertically is a really great practice. And the next growing tip for maximizing your space is to plant root crops and above ground crops in the same space. Most root crops are cool weather crops, and so this will likely take place in your fall garden or very early spring. But it's a wonderful strategy to plant a row of a root crop next to a row of an above ground crop. So, for example, you could plant a row of carrots next to a row of spinach, or a row of radishes next to a row of lettuce. There are many variations, and it's such a great way to maximize all of your planting space. The next step to planting your garden is figuring out how many plants to grow. And truthfully, it's much easier to overplant than you think. Unless you are planning to harvest a large batch of a certain crop to preserve, then you don't need too many of one thing. Of course, when it comes to vegetables such as carrots, one carrot seed produces one carrot. So if you want to have 15 carrots, you should probably plant at least 20 seeds so that you get the correct amount of carrots. But when it comes to something like squash or cucumbers, one plant will produce so many fruits. For example, on average, one zucchini plant will produce 6 to 10 pounds of produce in a season, which is about 20 to 30 medium zucchinis. On average, a cucumber plant produces 10 to 15 cucumbers per season, and a tomato plant typically produces 15 to 30 tomatoes. So you can get a ton of fresh produce from just a few plants. And the next thing to consider is if you're planning to save seeds. Saving seeds is such a wonderful gardening practice, but you can only save seeds from heirloom plant varieties. Even though you can technically save seeds from hybrids, they won't be true to the variety that you're saving from. So, for example, if you have a Better Boy tomato, which is a hybrid tomato, and you save those seeds and plant them, they won't produce or they won't grow a hybrid or a Better Boy tomato. Sorry. So, in order to get the true variety that you want, you need to save seeds from an heirloom. And another best practice is that you need to keep the plants isolated if you really want that true variety. So, for example, peppers can cross pollinate. And so, if you have two pepper plants that are different varieties next to each other, they can cross pollinate. And then the seeds may be a cross between those two varieties. So, if you really have a special bell pepper, for example, that you want, you need to have that bell pepper planted all by itself so that it can't cross pollinate with any other peppers, and then you can save those seeds. I don't always keep it that specific, but I do try to think ahead of what I really want to save seeds from, and then I do try to keep those crops isolated, and that's the best practice. Another tip is that you have to always make sure that you let the fruits or vegetables fully mature before you harvest the seeds. If you harvest them when they're too young, the seeds probably won't be fully mature, and so they won't be viable for planting. So make sure you let them fully mature. The next great gardening strategy to take advantage of is succession planting. Succession planting is when you regularly plant small quantities of a crop at different times in order to get a continuous harvest, versus planting just one huge crop at once and getting only one big harvest. For example, instead of planting 100 carrots on the same day, you could plant 10 carrots every 2 to 3 weeks and space out your harvest. Succession planting is also great for plants like squash and cucumbers. I mentioned on the previous slide how one plant can produce a large harvest. So a great strategy is to plant just 1 or 2 squash plants on your first planting date, and then wait 3 or 4 weeks and plant 1 or 2 more. This way, as the first plant starts to decline, you'll have the next couple plants that will continue producing longer into the season. And then Another great thing to do in your garden that will help conserve water and save time is setting up irrigation. I believe every gardener needs to have their garden set up on irrigation. It allows you to go out of town and not worry about your plants dying, and it just gives you that much needed time each day, because as the summers get hot and life gets busy, we don't always have time to go out to our garden. And I hear so many people say they don't want to grow a garden because they don't have time to water and take care of it. Well, if you have it set up on irrigation and a timer, you really don't have to worry about it. And so it's a great way to just make watering simple, and it helps save water, and helps your plants definitely grow better because they're going to be getting that consistent amount of water every day, even if you're too busy to go out in the garden. And so when it actually comes time to plant, it's important to give each variety the optimal amount of space it needs to grow. Every variety will say on the seed packet or the tag how much space it needs, and so be sure to follow those guidelines. Putting plants closer together just for the sake of trying to get more shoved into one spot won't make your plants grow better. And so I know it's tempting to try and crowd our plants, but you really need to make sure you give them the proper amount of space, which will prevent disease and pest problems. The closer together plants are, they are stressed, and so it's just going to result in poor growth, and you're likely going to have diseases and more pests. And then as you continue through the season, my last tips for a successful garden are to harvest frequently, check for pests daily, and weed often. The more often you harvest your produce, the more productive the plants will be. And then if you check for pests daily or as frequently as you can, it's much easier to treat them and prevent them. At the first sign of pests, I just spray them off with a water hose, and that's a really easy, effective way of getting rid of the pests on your plants. And if I have to, then I will treat them as needed, but you can pretty much just spray off the bugs with water, and that's a really easy way to get rid of them. You can also do things like I mentioned earlier in the presentation about planting marigolds that will help prevent pests. There's lots of great things to do to just organically keep the pests down. And then lastly, by staying on top of the weeds, it will be so much easier to manage, and they won't take away the nutrients in the soil from your vegetables. By mulching, that's going to keep the weeds down. If you mulch your walkways, that's going to keep weeds down. So if you just implement all of these great gardening practices, everything that sometimes makes gardening difficult kind of just goes away. If you mulch, you won't have as many weeds. And if you put your garden on irrigation, you won't have to water by hand. Just all of these things that really make gardening easy and great. And so now that we've covered all of the steps to starting a raised bed garden and growing healthy vegetables, it's time for you to get your raised bed garden going. I'm so thankful that you watched this presentation today, and I will see you later.